All right, so what Wyatt and I are going to talk about now is we're going to talk about systems and systems theory, just some nice light reading. And what I wanted to do was just show you a visual diagram of, kind of an analogy of kind of the scientific way that the mind works. Okay, so you might want to just take a look at this up on the screen here. And this is what's known as a Rube Goldberg machine, a convoluted contraption. And in this case, he pulls a little pin, and then a ball is triggered to roll down a couple of different slopes. And there's a Newton's cradle involved, you'll notice, in the contraption that knocks over some dominoes and a whole bunch of other things and triggers a squawking bird to be launched, pulling a pin and dropping a rock on his head, which squeezes out the toothpaste onto his toothbrush perfectly. I find this to be an excellent visual for the human mind and how it works, because that's kind of the indirect nature of how we do things and how we need them to get done. We were designed and evolved, so to speak, shaped to live in an environment that doesn't exist anymore. And we've become reshaped to live in an environment that existed not too long ago, but was still nothing like this one. And complex languages and logic and inundation and, kind of the super societies that we've gotten into. When you put that old mind and all those modules together with this situation, in order to get anything done, really, in order to get anything done and create really big success, you have to start thinking like this. You actually have to start thinking and behaving in the world like this. You have to learn to trick yourself into tricking yourself into setting up the situation so that when you pull the pin, the toothpaste comes out on your toothbrush in the future. In a way, this is an ingenious device. I mean, you gotta imagine that, I want to see the brain of the person that even designed this picture. Okay, good. So with that as an introduction to systems theory, I give you the Venerable Right Reverend Dr. Woodsmall.
Herr Doctor Professor, yes.
Oh, Dr. Professor Woodsmall, sorry. The Venerable Right Reverend Dr. Professor.
Herr Doctor Professor.
Herr Doctor Professor. I think it's kind of light on the hair, but anyway.
Exactly. Well, it's gray, and the reason it's that way is because my students and you have helped make it that way. So anyway. Okay, so we're talking about these things called systems. Now, obviously, as individuals, we don't exist in isolation. We exist as part of a culture, but also we exist in interaction. And so normally, when we look at ourselves or we look at the situation, we focus then on each of us as a unit and seeing us as independent. And we could also begin to focus on the connections between us, which provides a totally different view. So we can look at the parts or we can look at the whole. We can look at the parts or we can look at the whole. So a whole is made up of parts. We've all heard that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So a whole is made up of parts. So where do we focus our attention? A lot of people focus totally on the parts. Other people focus on the whole, and other people focus on the interconnections. So this has very practical consequences. So how do we build a better car? How do we build a better car? So our normal reaction and the reaction of General Motors and Ford and Chrysler and all of the companies is the way to build a better car is to get better parts. So if we got better parts, we get a better car. So what would happen if we were to go out and figure out what the best of every part in a car is? So let's say who's got the best motor? Could be Rolls-Royce. Who's got the best air brakes? Could be Westinghouse. Who's got the best carburetor? We get that. Who's got the best left tail right? Maybe Toyota. And we bring the best parts of every part of a car in the world. We bring them in and we put them right here. So what do we got? Do we have the best car in the world? No, we got a heap of junk. We got a bunch of parts that are not interconnected, that don't form a whole, that don't fit together and don't work. So how do we build a better car? So the usual focus is create better parts. It's not the parts, it's the interaction between the parts that counts. The system is the product of the interaction and not the sum total of the parts. So the interaction then is a way we need to begin to studying things. And now then, Evan and I have been talking about structure and process and ways of looking at things. And when we begin to focus then and look out into the world, and we begin to realize that the world is made up of wholes, and it's made up of each of these wholes is made up of parts, and that if we were just to study that relationship, that structure, then there's going to be valuable information that's going to apply in huge numbers of different contexts, because these are the laws that underlie and explain wholeness and partness. Wholeness and partness. Now, everything in the world, if we start at any level, then things are made up of parts, and that they are part of a greater whole, which is part of a greater whole, which is part of a greater whole. Ad infinitum, all the way up, all the way down. We can go all the way from the subatomic particles up to the universe. And so what we're studying is the structure of these interconnections. And so there's a few words we need to begin to understand, the concepts that we're going to use as labels. So we've had, so far, we mentioned a couple of them. We've mentioned the word system. We mentioned whole. We've mentioned parts. We've mentioned interaction. And a new word called holon, H-O-L-O-N, a holon. And a holon was a term that was coined that means a whole part. So that everything is a holon, everything is a whole part. You are a holon, you're made up of parts, and every part of you is a holon made up of parts, and you're part of this class, and so the class is a holon. So we got different levels of holons. And the word holon is important to us because it helps us to realize that most of the time we're either focused on the whole or we're focused on the parts. And that wherever we're focused, then that itself is simply another level, and it's made up of wholes and parts, and it's made up of wholes and parts, ad infinitum.
So I first got into the holon concept through Ken Wilber's work. And the big aha for me in the holon discussion is that it seems that we humans, liking things to be one way or another and not both, and if it's one, it can't be the other, that we seem to see partness and wholeness as being opposites of each other. Okay, you don't look at a tail light on a car and think, okay, well, that's a whole tail light. Right? It kind of seems to not have any function without the car. But if you go to the part of the factory that makes tail lights, making a perfect tail light, right, it's very important. If you go inside the tail light and you look at the bulb that's in there, whoever makes those bulbs, that's a whole bulb. That's very important. And in reality, out here, there are no parts, because every part is also simultaneously a whole. And there are no holes because every whole is simultaneously a part. So the core idea here is whole dash part as one thing. You remember Wyatt was talking about in general semantics that if you'd like to talk about a bigger concept and stringing together smaller concepts that all link to make the bigger concept, you add dashes between them so that it's obvious that they're linked. A whole part, whole dash part, means it's a whole and a part. Now, it's really a little bit of a brain twister when you realize that a whole-on or a whole part, when you look at something like the tail light or you look at a cell, that it's a whole and it's a part, but also the thing that it's a part of is also a whole, and the thing that's a part of is a whole. And then within it, the things that are its parts that make it up are also wholes on their level. So as Wyatt was saying, categorization, this is a thing that minds do. It's not something that nature does. So whole-on is a good way to draw circles around things in reality and say, okay, that's one thing. But at least we're calling attention by calling it a whole-on and by calling it a whole part to kind of put a little asterisk next to it that says, by the way, this is one of those key ideas that violates the normal way that humans like to think. So when you say whole-on, when you think whole-on, whenever you say or think whole or part in the future, just put a little asterisk next to it and remember whole-on. And as you're talking about it as a part, see its wholeness a couple of levels up and down. And if you're ever talking about something as a whole, whether it be a physical thing, a system, whatever, see what it is a part of. It's very mind expanding, and it helps you to really experience anything that you're experiencing as part of a much bigger, more integrated system. Okay, so whole on, important word, important idea or concept, because it kind of breaks down some of these human chimp with a brain and some language structures, right? It's a light shining into the dark of that whole thing that we keep doing over and over. Just like replacing be or is or are with experience as, this is another one, whole on. Okay? It's a little bit of a waker-upper.
It allows us to begin to start seeing interconnections and to focus on cooperation, collaboration, as opposed to seeing distance and isolation.
Can I, would this be a good moment to talk about the cause-effect connection too?
We can start now.
Does that make sense right before this, or
Okay,
you think later?
fine.
Yeah, okay. So as I've been thinking about whole-ons, and I realized that they were, kind of the definition is whole part, and it's a vertical hierarchical concept, and studying systems and just doing a lot of thinking about systems and interactions with people and thoughts and so forth, it struck me that in a cause-effect loop, that every element is both a cause and an effect. So when we take the Newton's cradle and we pull one of the balls back and we let it go, it's a cause to move the other ball on the other end, but it's also an effect when that ball comes back. And that all whole-ons on the vertical level of hierarchy, they're whole parts and whole parts and whole parts. On the horizontal level, on the system level, interacting with other whole-ons on its level in a system, that it's also a cause-effect, cause-effect, or an affected cause. Got it? It's a cause-effect. We tend to think of most things as either cause or effects, but something that breaks that paradigm a little bit and is closer to reality is that it's a cause-effect. So whole-ons are cause-effects, and when they get together, they operate in systems.
Okay, and when we say they're cause-effect, so what makes the car run? What makes the car run? gas, the engine, the motor, the carburetor, the tires, the whole. So that there are multiple factors involved, and it's not just one thing. So let's get a little more technical. So Russell Ackoff, probably one of the two greatest system thinkers on the planet, or was, says that a whole, he's defining a system, a whole that cannot be divided into independent parts. Each part of a system has properties that it loses when separated from the system. And every system has some properties that none of its parts do. So once again, what drives the car? All of the parts together are involved in driving the car. And that the car cannot be divided into independent parts. We can take independent parts, but we no longer have a car. When we take the parts out, it doesn't work. So we need all of the parts. We just not some of the parts. We need all of the parts. Technically, there are some parts that may not be required. We call them appendices. And so just like you've got an appendix that doesn't seem to serve any function. Okay, so every part of a system has properties it loses when separated from the system. And so if we take the engine out, then the engine can run, but it can no longer drive the car. If we take the tires off, then they are simply a piece of rubber, but they're no longer part of the car. And when we put all this stuff together, magically, we have a car. When we put it all together, magically, we have a car. It's like when you're a little child and you're in the kitchen and your mother was making something, like she was baking a cake, and you really like cakes or brownies or whatever she's making, and she puts all this stuff out and gets all of these ingredients, and you go, Mama, Mama, where's the cake? And she says, I'm gonna make it. And you go, what are you doing? So she gets the flour and she gets the milk and she gets the sugar and she puts all this together. She mixes it together and she pops it in the oven, and then amazing, out pops the cake. So all of a sudden now, before we had all of these parts, the milk, the sugar, the flour and everything, none of them were the cake. But when we put them together and we combined them together, suddenly they had a property that none of them individually had. Suddenly they were cakeness. Suddenly we had a cake. Amazing thing. So it's amazing how parts come together, how we can put them together in such a way that what we end up with is something greater that has properties that none of the individual elements have. Now then, once again, we can use this as a metaphor on many different levels, and we will. So we can talk about mechanical, we can talk about baking a cake. We could also talk about human interactions, and we could take a group of people and put them together in a team. And each of them is a part of the team, but through the interaction of the team, they may be able to create things that no single individual was able to do. Okay, so that's the first level. Let's get a little more specific here to understand a system. So Ackoff, his more expanded definition is he's got 5 parts. A whole that contains 2 or more parts that satisfy 5 conditions. So a system is going to have 5 conditions. 1, the whole has 1 or more defining functions. This implies that it is part of a larger system, and its function is the role that it plays in the larger system. So Eben was talking earlier, we were talking about the holons, and he was saying if you want to take anything in the universe, then it's connected to other things, and then you need to be asking, okay, I'm coming in at this level, what is the greater whole of which it is a part, and what is the parts that make it up? Now, we live in a world in which we're used to dealing with machines, and we're used to taking things apart. We're good at taking things apart. We're good at analyzing. We're good at decomposing. But the opposite effect is one that the world desperately needs. The opposite effect is, how do we create synthesis? How do we put things together so that we create a bigger whole that has properties that we would not be able to guess from any of the components in isolation? And so synthesis then To synthesize, we've got to chunk up. So there's a basic question you need to ask. Whenever you're going in to study anything, instead of what are the parts and how can we keep taking it apart, instead ask a different question. The question you ask is, what is the greater whole of which this is a part, and what function does it play in that greater whole? What is the greater whole of which it is a part, and what function or role does it play in the larger system? Okay, the second of the 5 characteristics, each part in the set can affect the behavior or properties of the whole. Any element which does not have an effect on the whole is an add-on, attachment, or appendix, and not a part of the system. So every part is necessary. Every part can affect the behavior or properties of the whole. If we take out any part, the whole doesn't work. If we vary the part, then we're going to vary the behavior and effectiveness. And so that therefore all are necessary. Third, there is a subset of parts that is sufficient in one or more environments for carrying out the defining function of the whole. Each of these parts is separately necessary but insufficient for carrying out the defining functions. These are the essential parts of the system, without which it could not carry out its defining function. The system may also have non-essential parts. So you can have a car. So if you live in California, the windshield wipers may not be so essential. Or maybe if you live in the desert, they're not so essential. The mirror may not be essential. So there are parts that are there. It can still operate without the parts. It can still be a car, can still function. So some of the parts are critical. If you take out the engine, it's not going to work. If you take off the tires and you're running on the rims, it's going to be hard going. If you take out the carburetor, it's not going to work. So you got to have all these parts together. My snowblower stopped working, and it was considering, and I was getting a lot of heat from certain sources since snow was predicted and on the horizon, and I was being asked why I hadn't dealt with this situation sooner. So I took it in to find out why it didn't work, and apparently they disassembled it, and that they found there was a mouse nest in the air intake. And I said, well, how did that get there? And they said, well, mice like to climb into holes, and they feel safe, and they like to build things. So once again, that was an unessential thing that messed up the whole thing and cost me a lot of money to get that fixed. So, okay, so the essential parts. One essential part is the air intake. 4, the way that the behavior or properties of each part of a system affects its behavior or properties depends on the behavior or properties of at least one other part of the system. Okay, the bottom line, no part of the system has an independent effect on the system of which it is a part. So, one of the things we're going to find that's going to be a consequence of this is when we begin to focus on systems, one of the rules of systems is the harder you push, the harder the system pushes back. You can't just go in and change one thing. If you try to change one thing, other parts are going to change in order to compensate, so that no part can independently affect the properties of the whole. At least one other part is going to be involved in the process. So if we want to speed up the car, we give it more gas, we've got to have more air, we've got to change the timing. So you just can't go in and do one thing that's going to improve everything. Any one thing you change, at least one other thing is going to have to change. There was this great, I remember on television, show where you got this handyman and everything. So they're going to have a contest for who can build the most powerful lawnmower. And so one of the guys decides he's got a brilliant idea. He's going to mount a helicopter motor on a lawnmower. So he's obviously going to win the contest. So they have this one great picture. So it shows the start. You hear the gun go off for the start of the race. And then you get an overhead view. And you see that all of these lawnmowers are going down to the first corner, where they make a turn and they go 90 degrees to the right, except for one. that just goes right through the fence and just keeps going. So once again, it's always trade-offs. It's always trade-offs. If you add one thing, then you're going to have to add other things to compensate for it. So if you build a more powerful engine, you got to have a more powerful frame. And you got to have more powerful brakes in order to be able to control it. So you can never then simply no one part is going to independently affect the system. There's always going to be at least one other part that's going to have to change. And last, the effect of any subset of parts on the system as a whole depends on the behavior of at least one other subset. No subset of the parts of the system has an independent effect. So once again, this is the whole nature of systems, this interconnectivity, that no one part directly affects the outcome. It has to indirectly affect it through relating to other people. So there are 5 corollaries to this, which is where the rubber meets the road. First, the defining function of a system cannot be carried out by any of its parts of the system taken separately. When any system is taken apart, it loses its defining function and its essential properties. So what happens in a world in which we're continually taking things apart? It's like our normal way of trying to understand things, and I'm sure that when you were a child at some point, you took something of your parents apart that you couldn't put back together and that they did not appreciate. In science, they decided, how will we understand a human being? How do we understand a biological organism? I know, we'll pull it apart and we'll study all of the parts. And then when you took and looked at all the parts, there was nothing in the parts that would indicate what a living organism were. Where does this thing called life come from? It wasn't in any of the parts, taking the parts apart. So one of the usual approaches and one of the reasons we're looking at systems is, one of the things we do is we try to take things apart and then try to figure out how they work by looking at all the parts. And that does not work, but people do it continually, and it's the usual mode of trying to deal with things. It's called analysis. Take it into the parts, study the parts. You do it, organizations do it, the world does it, and it's anti-systemic. 2, when an essential part of a system is separated from the system of which it is a part, that part loses its ability to carry out its defining function. So its defining function is the function it carries in the system. Once we take it out of the system, it has no function, because function has to do with the greater whole. Function has to do with the greater whole. Function has to do with the greater whole. I have a friend that I'm always having a discussion with around form and function. And she's Miss Form, and she says, I'm Mr. Function. And so I'm always asking, okay, what is the function that things are involved in? And so that once again, the function is always a function of a system, and it's always a function of a whole. So you can't talk about functions in isolation. You can only talk about them as part of the system. That seems a straightforward thing. It's amazing how when you try to explain that to some people, they have some kind of a mental block about understanding that.
But Wyatt,
I know, yes.
form follows function.
Ah, yes. I've tried to explain that also, that therefore the function has priority, and that the form should follow the function. And I've had difficulty getting that concept across also. So there are limits to my communicative abilities under certain circumstances with certain people.
Well, you're so sweet and charming.
Systemically.
I don't understand how anyone
Exactly.
has trouble understanding you.
Okay, 5. Synergy requires an increase in the variety of behavior available to the parts of the system. So we got a new word here, synergy. So synergy is the way the parts work together. And synergy requires an increase in the variety of behavior available to the parts of the system. So that if then we want to, so this becomes important. So our normal approach to life when we encounter a boundary, since we're all basically dialecticians, is push harder. With enough force, we can knock the wall over. With enough force, we can get to wherever we need to go. The force can do it trap. Now then, one of the principles of systems theory is attributable, well, let's see, do I want to go there now? Well, I'll go there in a different way. So one of the things that's important is variety. Variety. So having more than one pathway to a destination. So if one is blocked, then we've got other options. If we can put the parts together in such a way that the parts then, and increase the variety of them, then we may be able to increase the behaviors available to the system. 5, a system taken as a whole can affect its parts in 2 ways: by increasing or decreasing the variety of the behavior that can be displayed. So the parts may make it better, the parts may make it worse. So, actually, then we've come to this word, so maybe the next step we need to go to is talk a little bit about this thing called variety. So, you see, systems have variety, and that, like this room, has incredible variety. And that variety amplifies extremely quickly. And so that, let me simply take an example. So if we start with 2 people in the room, and we could have one, we could say stand up, and then we could say sit down. So you got two options, standing and sitting. We go to the second person. So the first person that's sitting, we say stand up, sit down, and then we have the other person, first person sit down, and then we have the second person stand up, sit down. And now we got 2 people, we've already got 4 different possible variations on the situation. We add a third person, we got 8. We add a fourth person, we got 16. 5 people, we got 32. 6 people, we got 64. 7 people, we got 128. We'll call that 125. And we just keep then multiplying. And if we were to take all the people in this room, we're going to end up with trillions of possibilities. And what's amazing, it's a miracle that everybody is sitting, because out of the odds that happening, that everybody is sitting, when that, or the odds of that happening are something like 1 trillion or more to 1 that everybody in the room is sitting. So variety expands incredibly. And when we look at systems then, one of the challenges is, how do we control variety? How do we manage systems? How do we manage the room? How do we get everybody to be sitting? Well, that's because Eben has more variety than you do. And so he imposed constraints, ways of attenuating the variety. We found, and he's done a lot of research, one of the best ways to attenuate the variety was having people put a $20 bill in the bowl. That proved to be a very effective way of attenuating variety. So H. Ross Ashby was one of the cybernetic people. He said, only variety can attenuate variety. Only variety can control variety. Sometimes this is translated that any system, that element with the greatest flexibility of behavior will control the system. In any system, that element with the greatest flexibility is going to control the system. So it's not about pushing harder. It's not about pushing more. It's about doing something different. If what you're doing doesn't work, anything else has a greater probability of working than what doesn't work. And most people are dialecticians. Most people push harder. The secret is not pushing harder. The secret is requisite variety. The secret is doing something different. If I want to get from here to San Francisco, and I'm going to go up the interstate, and there's a blockage on the interstate, then I'm in big trouble. Whereas if I've only got one way to get there and it doesn't go, then I'm stuck. Whereas if I've got a bunch of side roads, if I go up the coast through Santa Barbara, if I take a different route, the more options I've got, the more likely I can get there, because I've got enough requisite variety that if what I'm doing isn't working, I can do something else. I can try something else. So this variety turns out to be a big thing. Variety turns out to be a big thing. And it's a big thing then because of the way that variety multiplies so quickly. As we've already said, if we look at the 100 people in the room, we got trillions of combinations of possibilities. And the fact that everybody's sitting, the odds on that are like 1 trillion or more to 1 that would happen. But nevertheless, that's what's going on. So variety increases rapidly, and so that one of the things is that we need to then be able to figure out ways to attenuate variety, to decrease growth. Growth left unregulated expands at an astronomical proportion. And nature actually has built-in ways to deal with this. So rabbits are famous for multiplying rapidly. And you start with 2, and quickly you got a bunch, and then quickly you got a huge number of them, and they just keep going on and on and on, increasing at an exponential rate. And then what happens is interesting. So that they reach a certain point, and if they kept going, then the whole planet would be filled with rabbits. But that doesn't happen. So what happens is once they reach a certain density, amazingly enough, they start dying of heart attacks. So what happens is when there's too many of them, it stresses them out, and nature has a way of simply stopping them. It's like the lemmings. When there's too many lemmings, they all go to the sea and drown. So nature has built in ways of being able to attenuate this unlimited growth. Now then, so we're talking on some abstract things here. Now, Mr. Pagan, who's running a business, then in running a business, then one of the things you have to do is there are times you've got to increase growth, there's times you've got to attenuate growth. And the normal ways that people try to go about it is put more money in the business, get tougher management, try to focus on all these things, whereas requisite variety is going to be the key. And so we'll come back to that.